have you with us. Without any further ado, I would like to pass the floor to the team to take us through their group vote. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be discussing an issue that is a global threat, climate change. Over the past century, the Earth has witnessed a significant warming and temperature increasing, with 2016 being the warmest year currently on record. The climate system is warming unequivocally, with natural snowfall decreasing as well as the winter season shortening. No one is exempt to this, even sport. With increasing temperature, this means that the increase for costs for winter sport are going up as well. With warming temperatures, it's causing melting and shrinking ice sheets, which are increasing the sea level, and this results in the absorption of sunlight and increasing temperatures. The Arctic ice cap at one point was the size of the US. It is now shrunk by 40%. Even though people may think machine-made snow will fix this problem, it won't, because you still need reduced temperatures to be able to keep it sustained. Today, we'll be discussing climate change in the Olympic Winter Games, the impacts and potential risks that this poses. We partnered with the International Olympic Committee to work on this project. I'd like to introduce my team. So we have Melody Lin from China, myself, Melissa Drake from Canada, Nicholas Schoenfeld from Austria, Sung Jun from South Korea, as well as our supporting team. So Ainsley from the IOC, who was our client, as well as Julie Geert, who is our supervisor from AISTS, and Permin, who is our advisor at the Institute for Snow and Avalanche Research. So a little bit about our project and how we decided to approach this. So we decided to do a mix of current literature as well as interviews. When we reviewed our literature, we went over journal articles, websites, weather data, information from the IOC, as well as looking at past and current reports from different Olympic Games and bids. So we focused on 4 main regions: the Alps, Canada, China, and South Korea, mainly because we wanted to look at places that were currently hosting the games, such as PyeongChang, future hosts, as well as people and locations that have a large winter sports market. When we were conducting our interviews, we interviewed 13 different people from various organizations. These included places like the NHL, PyeongChang 2018, Beijing 2022. We also talked with people from VANOC and from different federations such as FIS, IBU, and other organizations, including big committees as well. We're now going to look a little bit more into the impact of climate change.
This map shows the 19 cities that has already held Olympic Winter Games, except the recently held PyeongChang Olympics. Now here is the question. By the middle of this century, out of all these 19 cities, how many of them will still be able to host the Olympic Winter Games? The answer is 10. And this number will decrease to 6 by the end of this century. So this is what the projection that we have around the world. Now we are going to take you a tour around the 4 major regions for winter sports.
First of all, Swiss and the Alps regions. The Alps regions are the largest ski market globally, and over 90% of alpine ski areas can be considered as natural snow reliable. However, the number of those areas is going to drop when temperature increases. See the graph. The graph shows the number of natural snow reliable ski area in Alps, and the bar in the graph they shows the number of those in present and plus 1 degree, 2 degree, and 4 degree from the second bar. The ski slopes in high altitude, like Valais in the middle and the Graubünden, they are relatively reliable, but those in the low altitude, like peripheral region of the Alps, for example of For example, certain part of Germany, like Schwaben and Allgäu region, they will face a big challenge to maintain the snow level to operate ski slope with the natural snow. So, and the importance of machine-made snow will be likely to increase more and more in the future in those regions.
Now let's turn our eyes to North America. In general, we take example of Canada. The whole country of Canada is going to move toward a wetter Canada with more rain instead of ice and snow. When we look at the Lakeland region of Canada, without snowmaking, the season is going to decline by 47%. And the amount of snowmaking required will increase 36 to 144% by 2020, which is just 2 years later, and 48 to 187% by the middle of this century. This sounds a bit terrifying. So how about Asia? With the coming of Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics, we tap into some researches which looks into the Beijing-Zhangjiakou region, which is where all the Olympic venues is situated, and the projected temperature in February 2002 during the competition days is -14 to 2 degrees. To reach the requirement of snow depth for the competition, the 60 to 95% of snow will need to be made by the snow.
And lastly, South Korea. South Korea's ski industry rapidly became popular, but all ski resorts in South Korea are dependent on machine-made snow for operating ski slope because of lack of the natural snow. However, if climate change continues at the current level, it is going to be really hard to maintain ski slope with machine-made snow as well. The graph and the screen, there will be 14 ski slope available out of 17 in 2030s, and only 2 available ski slope in 2060s. And there will be no place to enjoy ski in Korea in 2090s. So the climate change obviously influenced to both natural and machine-made snow, and we need to mitigate the impact of climate change on winter sports and prepare for the change of future.
So, in Questionnaire report, we've looked into technologies that are used to mitigate these impacts of climate change on each respective sport. So, in 1924, in Chamonix, for the first time, the army was used to transport snow, and people looked into weather insurance. Then, in St. Moritz, ice hockey moved indoors, and the systematic use of climate data was implemented. In 1952 in Oslo, the first time large scale of snow transfer was done to the venues as well as snow stockpiling. And in Squaw Valley, also figure skating and curling moved indoors, as well as ratraks were first time used to compact the snow. Then in Grenoble, refrigerated bobsleigh and luge tracks were implemented. In 2010 as well, the in-runs for the ski jumps were also started to be refrigerated. In 1980 in Lake Placid, the first large-scale snowmaking machine were put in place, and they expanded their weather forecast services. They put weather stations all over the area and all over the venues. And till now, in PyeongChang, all of this is still used, just the technologies have become better and have adapted. Then we've looked into technologies for outdoor sports. For example, the dry slopes, which are basically mats that you lie out on hills or mountains, that should have the same gliding abilities as snow, and with snow sport equipment, you can glide on it like with a snowboard or ski. Then we've looked into machine-made snow that's used everywhere, but we've looked especially in the TIS machines, which means temperature-independent snow production. As recently, there are some snow machines that are able to produce snow up to 30 degrees. For example, the Snowtech that was used in Sochi. And then what has become very important with the largest snow storage operation in place ever in Sochi, where you keep the snow from the previous year that you either do, farm artificially or naturally under artificial or natural products over the summer and can then reuse it the next season. Then for indoor technologies, we've looked into refrigeration systems and LED lighting, because the refrigeration system is the part of an ice rink that consumes the most energy, and newer products are able to reduce the amount of energy necessary by a huge bit. And LED lighting, not only are they more energy efficient than traditional halogen lamps, but they also emit less heat, therefore you need less energy to cool down your ice rink. Then summer adaptations, a few sports have them. An example is a cross-country rollerblade, which is the summer adaptation of traditional cross-country skiing, with the IBU actually having in place World Cup and World Championships already. And then grass skiing, which was actually invented as a training method for alpine skiers and is now its own sport under the umbrella of FIS.
So moving on to the Olympic program, we thought that this was important to look at because this is what's going to be affected by climate change in the future. So when looking at this, we worked with the IOC to get documents in regards to what kind of questions were asked to the international federations when sports are being added to the Olympic program, as well as what questions are being asked to the host cities when they're looking at adding sports as well. So when we first looked at the IF questionnaire, there was 2 points on environment. We had the event evaluation criteria as well as policies. So these asked, like, what do you use event criteria? Do you have policies for the environment, for climate change? Where we found some potential gaps were the fact that there wasn't a lot of detail in terms of what kind of event evaluation criteria do you use? Where do you get the information? Is there a standard that should be used? And then in terms of the policies, there wasn't a lot of accountability for policies. So it was asking, do you have policies? But there could be room to ask, what are your policies? Do you stay accountable for your policies? How do you implement those policies? So these could be ways to improve what the IFs are doing for the program. And then when we looked at the host city questionnaire, we found that there were actually no questions on it in regards to the environment or climate change. So then how are the host cities, or what are the host cities supposed to do in terms of mitigating climate change or working to be sustainable with the environment? When we were conducting our interviews, we interviewed Patrick Jarvis with Canada Snowboard. He said the IOC and IPC need to consider the scale of their events. Constant pressures to add more events. I think they've hit critical mass. Can't just move an event from one mountain to another. So already the Olympic program is very large. You only have 2 weeks to fit it in. If we keep adding sports to or events to the Olympic program, how are the Olympics going to be able to manage if there's cancellations, postponements, delays? So it's really looking at that and seeing how can we move forward. Then we also interviewed Arthur De Jong with Whistler Ski Resort, which was one of the venues for Vancouver 2010. And he said, Whistler's unable to host FIS World Cups now. When the events are in North America at the beginning of the season, Whistler can't guarantee the right conditions. So an Olympic venue from 8 years ago is no longer being used for World Cups or World Championships because they can't guarantee snow in November. So this is a problem if you want to make sure that you can sustain not only the Olympic Winter Games, but winter sports in general. Now, we also looked at, when we were talking with some of the different international federations and doing our research, we also looked at sustainability practices by IFs in different organizations. So for example, NHL Green is a program done by the NHL where they do food recovery program, LED lighting, and building automation to help make sure that their buildings and where their biggest resources in terms of energy are being used and maximized to the best of their ability. We also worked with FIS, and they're currently working to host carbon neutral events so that they can offset their carbon footprint and help mitigate potential impacts for the environment. And then discussing with, when we looked into the IIHF, they actually had a bike program in Cologne, Germany for their 2017 World Championships, where they provided bikes to all of their staff and their volunteers so that when they wanted to move from venue to venue, they could use a bike instead of a car. So then next we looked at the candidature process and where we can host these events. So when we interviewed Claude Stricker with Sion 2026 bid committee, he said a good question is, what would a scenario be if things really got worse with climate change? Would it be a scenario where you have to think about a plan B with another location? So what are some of your mitigation strategies? Are you providing backup locations if, for example, one mountain doesn't have enough snow? Are you going to move it to another mountain? How are you going to work with this to be able to develop a comprehensive bid or candidate city so that when you're looking at the future, especially, for example, in 8 years, you can mitigate those potential effects of climate change? So when we looked at this, we found that there's little information specific to the impacts of climate change and what host cities are expected to do to mitigate these impacts. So it's important to make sure that there's information going from one host city to the next to be able to have a complete plan when moving from one cycle to the next. The IOC also has their sustainability strategy, which has 5 pillars of sustainability, and one of them is actually climate change. So the IOC is making an effort to develop areas and help mitigate the effects of climate change. And then we also found that it's important for OCOGs to have mitigation strategies in case of climate change, because we're planning 8, 10 years out, so it's important to kind of know where the trends are going. Some of the event mitigation strategies we found in our interviews were with PyeongChang 2018 Organizing Committee. They worked to reduce energy consumption with their venues, transportation, and all aspects that they could. We had Calgary 2026 Bid Committee, where they are adhering to federal policies and working to ensure that they are compliant with both the Government of Canada as well as the City of Calgary to ensure that they're being as forward-thinking as they can. And then when discussing with Sion 2026 Bid Committee, they were looking to predict future weather patterns. So looking at what's happened in the past, how can we adapt this and look at it and apply it to future so that we can have an idea of what may happen. And the Vancouver 2010 Organizing Committee, one of the examples they used was the best way to transport snow without a large environmental impact. So when you're moving it from one part to another, are you using rail? Are you using car? Are you using air? And not only that, but are you moving plant species from one part to another? Because that can also have an impact.
So for the course of our report, we've looked at the number of cancellations in the last 5 years. And we've defined the sports, we put them in different categories depending on how high they are at risk. So at high risk you have the downhill skiing, then medium risk bobsleigh and luge, and then low risk ice hockey, speed skating and figure skating as they are indoors. But if you want to look at the more complex way for defining how much a sport is at risk, we've defined a matrix that someone with a high expertise could actually use to see how much a sport is affected by global warming. Here we have the example of downhill skiing. So we take into account the cancellations, the policies and procedures, technology and adaptations, look at the current situations, then the actions they are having or doing, and the future impacts it's going to have. And so through the example of downhill skiing, let's look at the technologies used. So the current situation, machine-made snow production plus snow storage is in place. What are the actions? It's actually a requirement. Most locations have to have machine-made snow system in place to be able to hold events. And what could be the future impacts on the sport? Could lead to a shortening of the speed disciplines, increase in cancellations as we've seen before, but even more, and it could really affect the grassroots movement. And then you have a score out of 30. Here you see 18, so the sport is actually hugely impacted. So
now moving on to the conclusion, our first and main conclusion is that climate change is going to have a major impact on the Olympic Winter Games. No matter what way you look at it, there's going to be some impact. So whether it's where you can host the games, as we saw earlier, there's going to be a limited number of locations to be able to host. So how do we look at that and be creative in terms of where we can host and what kind of adaptations can we do to make sure that hosts are available? Then we also need to start being creative when looking at winter sport. Do we change our mindset in terms of maybe sports aren't snow or ice related? Maybe it's mountain running or mountain biking, and we look more at the location rather than the snow or the ice. And then finally, also looking at the development and social impacts of winter sport and how they'll be impacted by climate change. So how are people being introduced to these sports? Are they being introduced to these sports? Are the costs just too high that someone can't go out and ski anymore or can't go to an arena and play hockey? It's really important to look at these things, because if you can't grow the sports and develop them, how do you expect to be able to create elite level competitions like the Olympic Winter Games, where you're creating a fan base and making sure that people are watching, broadcasting, and showing up to the events and all of the things that go along with the Olympic Winter Games?
All right, so as the topic is so broad, and we only had a limited amount of time and a limited expertise on various topics in our team, we've defined a few more research areas people could look into after seeing a report. So, for example, the social impact of climate change, then the possibility of ski resorts having a zero impact, zero carbon emission, and how climate change would affect the accessibility of our sport, and a few more. So thank you very much for listening, and we're now open for questions.